Good day, everyone. Welcome to joining us once again for a great ITWeb webinar where we are going to unpack some of the challenges and opportunities that we can encounter today with technology, with the changing world. You know the story by now, the narrative. It has been COVID everywhere. It has been a massive technological change everywhere. And in a way, we were tremendously lucky that we were even able to make this change. But now the hard work is starting. Now, as the dust settles, we are finding there are lots of issues out there. And as you know, because you've tuned in for this webinar, security is a big concern. And there is, in a way, what I would call a security transformation underway. Things that we didn't even do a few years ago, or things that were really on the periphery of what we could do in security, are now becoming very much mainstream. And today we're going to touch on that, and we're going to look specifically at attacks and email security. Yes, the classic technology that we all love and hate, email, a big vector for attacks. This is what we will look at today. How do we secure that? So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you today to this ITWeb webinar. My name is James Francis. I will be your host for today. And today's webinar is co-hosted by Darktrace. We will soon hear from their email expert in terms of security on what you can do about it. And look, it is a big issue. I was just looking around for a few statistics. It's quite easy to find these days in terms of security. And here's one for you. In 2020, the UAE, for example, experienced 250% more attacks than before from cyber criminals. That's an extraordinary number. And the majority of them are coming through email. We know this, phishing, malware, man-in-the-middle attacks. There are all kinds of ways that they're using emails these days. And this is the shocker. According to research, 94% of advanced email attacks get through standard email security services. That is tremendous. That means that what you assume is going to keep your email protected is definitely not doing the job. And that's not so much a failure of the technology as an indication of the sophistication of the people who are doing these attacks. Remember, these are their jobs. This is their 9 to 5. And they've been remote working from the start. When all of us started remote working, the cyber criminals probably started throwing parties because they knew this was their time to shine. And unfortunately, it is. So how do we tackle this in the world today with remote working, with needing to follow your data and credentials everywhere with security? I would like to invite from Darktrace, Mariana Pereira, and she is the Director of Email Security Products at Darktrace. She's going to give us a presentation today on this topic, including a look at the anatomy of an attack on an online service and how they get there. So Mariana, I'm very glad for you to join us today. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your presentation, after which we will have a Q&A session. So please have your questions ready, because when we get to the end of it, you can throw those pertinent email security and general security questions out there, and we'll hear more from Mariana. Without further ado, thank you, Mariana. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you everyone for tuning in today and joining us in this session. First of all, I promise it will not be a doom session. There is a lot out there to be upset and worried about. And exactly as James has said, 94% of all cyber attacks are starting in the inbox. And I think that it's, we hear so much about the different challenges of securing our infrastructure, our data, the privacy concerns, and all of the different things that we need to juggle. I actually love the way that James has just said that, right? It's not a failure of technology that we are seeing this constant story repeat itself over and over again, but actually I think it's testament to the innovation of the attackers. And also, James, so true. They've been working from home or working remotely forever, and well, to some level, very coordinated and with call centers and whatnot, like true organizations. But I think it's really the prime time for us to be thinking in the middle of all of the changes, in the middle of the investments and the accelerations to global collaboration platforms and cloud structures and hybrid deployments and all of that stuff. This is a perfect moment for each and every one of you to also be considering the introduction of artificial intelligence in your security, in your risk mitigation, because ultimately I'm of the belief that for as much as we can harden the servers and firewalls, the vast majority, we've seen it, of attacks really comes down to people being tricked into inadvisable actions. And the email is the #1 way in which they're getting tricked. So I actually think of it not so much as email security per se, but it is about understanding the worker, how they work, how your business operates, because at the end of the day, a company is the collective makeup of the people who work there. So first of all, how are we working? Well, James said, it's huge changes, huge period of change. We've seen multiple analysts also estimates that just in the year 2020 alone, we have consolidated the efforts that were on the roadmap for many companies in terms of digital collaboration and transformation projects of the next 3 years. So a massive acceleration of new ways of working, of new tools that have been deployed. And more importantly, this is all a whole bunch of newness for the workers who, in many cases, have never used these applications. So it's a different mentality. If we think about the information itself that used to be stored physically on devices, computers, and servers within an office space that might have been protected not only from the digital point of view, but also physically there was office security around. What this adoption to the cloud has meant is that a lot of that critical information, intellectual property, trade secrets, contracts, are now being moved, and they reside not only in these cloud environments, but also on the laptops, in the inboxes, and in environments that have perhaps not as a fully developed awareness of the security that needs to be around this. So I'm thinking young workers who have shared networks with other people in their household, or households that share a computer, for instance, with young children who accidentally leave Zoom filters on. We've seen all of the examples of accidental changes also in configuration that could lead, unfortunately, to some kind of data loss or a cybersecurity incident. So what I mean to say is things are changing, they have changed, and they will continue to change. But what we're not going to do, I think it's a pretty fair assumption and statement for me to say, is that we're not going to go back to the way it was before. Many of these changes then have been made as a stopgap measure to allow workers to continue working, to allow the businesses to continue operating, even despite lockdown rules or travel restrictions. They're here to stay. And I think for many of us that are connected today, the thought now is, all right, so we've had to make these changes. This is the new normal. How can I possibly keep up with all of the different variations that are now present? That is because for security teams, these hybrid and SaaS models are very difficult actually to identify ongoing threats or emerging threats, because what we feel is that we've lost a lot of visibility from what used to be the visibility we had in the way that we could supervise the network to potentially not having visibility in this new configuration. So AI here is truly a force multiplier. It is almost like an extra person on your team, if you will, because essentially what we're able to do is to leverage that power of artificial intelligence, that massive amount of data processing and analysis, and then speed up the time that it would take a human to get to understanding what has happened. And we can do this with AI. Now, just to think a little bit more about this fragmented workforce, right? We've spoken about the acceleration and the impact of the acceleration of those digital transformation projects that have resulted in a lack of visibility for the security teams. There's also another thing about another consideration that I'd like to make here, which is that as some countries are reopening, as some industries are reopening, we've had some workers return to the office perhaps for a small period of time or some kind of flexible working. What we've actually seen in those initial stages was that some employees had inadvertently brought malware or other vulnerabilities that they had exposed their company with inadvertently. Perhaps they had downloaded unapproved technology. And the re-entering, the physical re-entering of the device then back into the corporate space has shown us that there was a bit of a spike also in this kind of attacks that might have come in through emails, had stayed dormant on the worker's device, and then once back into the corporate environment, started moving around. So email attacks, I think, also presents us a bit with this challenge, because it might be the door, it's that first step, but it is by no means an immediacy, right? You might receive an email and then we only see the effects of the attack or the effects of the of that breach months later. So that visibility that I was talking about, that understanding across the very large set of data, is absolutely critical for us not to worry so much about having to then go back and investigate everything, which of course we need to do. But it's about the immediacy of stopping that bad thing from happening and from taking root. So as we are trying to close the gaps between the different applications or the different ways in which we're thinking, all right, so we've got email security, we have corporate security, we have network security. Well, these silos that have permitted, to a certain extent, also the attackers to take advantage of the blind spots that are then created between the silos. Actually, we have that same fragmentation in our work patterns, but then we have convergences such as this, this convergence between the work and the personal lives and our digital lives. So it's essentially one big mess. Cyber criminals thrive on that mess. They thrive in moments of confusion. They use that as the way of entering an already messy environment and take advantage of that disruption to introduce more information. We saw last year, so many campaigns that were directly related to COVID in terms of topics. We've seen it again this year with third waves of lockdown. Click here for the latest information on the government. All of these sort of fearware campaigns that really take advantage of our need and our want of urgency of information that really goes hand in hand with disruption. The other tendency that we've seen this year is the reverse, is a beginning of trustware campaigns. So based on this, again, topic of disruption, what we're seeing is the exploitation of trust, trusted brands, trusted voices, trusted partners, trusted senders. And trusting a sender in a moment of disruption is absolutely key, because those are the ones where you'll let your guard down. And criminals know this, and that's also why we're seeing a huge surge in credential theft, in email impersonation attacks that ultimately lead to those business email compromise. So whatever the silo, whatever the taxonomy that you want to use, what I'd submit to you is that this fragmentation, this convergence of all these different parts of our lives, this huge disruption that we've lived through, really is setting the scene for the attackers to flourish. So how does AI come into this? Well, AI has been a term that we've heard for many, many, many years, and it's not all the same. Not all artificial intelligences will work in the same way or will even learn in the same way. Some are this notion of general AI. The more data I present, the better it's going to be at learning, the better it can see things. But actually, in the case of cybersecurity, there are different applications of AI. And what we saw in the past really was this notion of teaching a computer what an attack looks like so that it can find that again in the future. At Darktrace, what we've been doing for the past 7 years, really, since we've been founded, is actually starting with unsupervised AI. It's artificial intelligence that is able to work out what those patterns are. What are the clusters? What is normal? And by understanding what is normal for each and every organization, we are understanding essentially the DNA of that company. We call this the immune system, and we use this analogy extensively because it really is understanding the uniqueness of that infrastructure, the uniqueness of that business. And again, that business is made up of the people who work there and the way they work there. And what we saw during 2020 is that with the change in the physical aspects of how we work, AI did actually really, really well in the transition because it learned at speed. At the speed with which we moved, the AI was also capable to move and adapt to the new way of working. And that's because the workers themselves, we haven't really changed the way in which we work, the people that we work with, the collaboration and the communications that we have. Those are still there, and they were always happening in a digital space. So the AI was able to adapt its understanding of normal overnight, just as we did, and keep pace with that change. And as things will continue to change and evolve, you need an AI that will continue to learn and change and evolve with your company as it grows. Of course, the next question here is, well, if there was already a compromise, how does the AI know that that's not part of normal? Well, what we've seen is the power of this self-learning, and especially this idea of clusters and peer groups, is that we have a group of people. They could be developers, they could be marketers, they could be salespeople. It doesn't really matter. But when we see one person, one device, or one account acting in a very unusual way compared to its peer groups, that's usually a really good indicator that something is up. Not every anomaly, it's true, that not every anomaly is necessarily a threat, but definitely every threat starts with something weird, with an anomaly, with something unusual. And the ability for the AI to spot those very small and subtle deviations in the way that a device or worker or account is used is absolutely critical in then being able to allow the humans to action on that very, very slight change, but being able to also bring them visibility and understanding into what has happened. So I spoke about the sort of need of learning, and of course that's the unsupervised part. But at Darktrace, we also bring in supervised machine learning and deep learning and a whole bunch of different AI and machine learning methodologies. We have over 30 PhDs in our headquarters running R&D in Cambridge. And what I think is absolutely fascinating was then the application of these other uses of AI, or these other methodologies of AI, which then allowed us to bring things like the Cyber AI Analyst, which is able to do an automatic investigation at speed, at scale, across all of the different data sets, understand what are the pieces that made up that story and present it to us in a human digestible narrative. And of course, the autonomous response piece, which is absolutely critical. To use, again, the immune system analogy, it's almost like having a digital antibody that will step in to neutralize or contain that weird stuff, the attack, most probably, enforcing the pattern of life, enforcing the normal behavior, but restricting that anomaly so that it's not allowed to spread and it's not allowed to take root in the environment. Now, I promised you a use case and an anatomy of an attack. And the story that I want to share with you today is one that I'm sure you're familiar with, insofar that every single one of you will have likely heard some variation of this. I don't want you to be too hung up about the specifics of the sender, recipient, etc., but let's think of, like, who do you know that something like this has happened to? It just so happens that this story occurred throughout a proof of value. So this is a 30-day trial of Darktrace's AI that you can choose to deploy within your own ecosystem. And what happens is that when we deploy the artificial intelligence, we keep it in passive mode. So the AI will say to the security team, this is what I'd like to do, this is what I recommend you can do, but the humans are always in control, and so the AI isn't actually allowed to take action. And this is how this story then was allowed to play out, because the AI was still in passive mode. So we start with a pretty common start for any email security director, I think, to start, which is with a bunch of emails. What we have here is a collection of emails that are fake, to put it quite bluntly. We had multiple domains that were set up by an attacker. So we have multiple sending addresses. We have James Hardy at Safer Storage Systems. We have Alf Colvin and Kathy Anderson. None of these people actually exist, but they're sending in a request for a proposal for their companies. And notice that all of the subject lines are following a similar pattern. There's a recipe here, RFP for domain name. This is actually pretty simple to set up. Some automatic rules can be created, some commands can be created to purchase domains in bulk, and then set up those email campaigns and just sending them to a whole bunch of people, right? A spray and pray attack. We also see here that the AI has scored, this is Antigena email, scoring the different emails with various percentages of anomalies. And this is because it will have contextualized and it's trying to figure out how weird is this email given what it knows about the business. Maybe it's less weird for Stefan Lanham to be receiving requests for proposals, but it's very odd for John Costantini to be receiving them. We can see here from these little target icons, the little red next to the dates at the bottom of each of these squares, that's the AI saying, like, I would have taken a response. And I've looked into these and it would have actually stopped all of these emails from coming through. The reason it would have stopped them is because all of these emails contained a link for the RFP to be submitted, specifically through what appeared to be a SharePoint environment. Now we're again, back to that idea of collaboration, cloud platforms. Who here hasn't sent a document or received a document from someone saying, hey, can you help me out? It's too big for email. Let me put it on a Dropbox, on a SharePoint, in a Google Workforce, whatever it is. And again, it's not to say that these tools aren't secure. The proper application of them has been wonderful, but attackers know this. And so they will hide an attack within a document purporting to be, or behind a link that purports to be a SharePoint, a legitimate business application. So this link here was clicked on. Paul Peterson clicked on the link. He also had received one of these emails. His was 100% anomalous. And Paul, believing maybe he was new-ish to the idea of request for proposals, Paul clicks on the link, puts in his username and password, and essentially hands over the credentials to the attackers. Up until now, what we have is a combination of spoofing or, just creating some generic, I don't know if those companies legitimately exist, so I should check myself before I claim that it's spoofing. It might have been spoofing. It might have just been a spray and pray attack with new company names. And then followed by impersonation of a Microsoft SharePoint login page. And now we have a credential theft. You can still get to the point of credential theft without starting with an email. That is true. So up until now, that beginning part of the story can actually change by stealing passwords, by keylogging, or any other way in which you can steal a password and pretend to be Paul Peterson and have legitimate, or better, have a true username and password access to this user's environment. What the attackers then did is, once they were able to get into the Microsoft 365 environment, they started creating new rules to permit their activities to not trip up any other alarms or any other kind of rules-based indicators. So here the user created an anonymous sharing link. And we can see that the AI, again, is scoring this particular activity at a 56% anomaly score. This is that ability to look beyond the silo. We have an understanding of who Paul Peterson is. The email might have been very anomalous. This is a slightly different score. The AI is, again, telling us, hey, there's something weird here happening with Paul Peterson. Let me step in and let me do something about it. It was in passive mode, so it wasn't allowed to do something about it. The humans didn't have eyes on this particular user at that moment. And within a 25-minute period to follow, the account, Paul Peterson at company name, sent out 1,685 emails to contacts, to partners, to business collaborators, you name it. Of course, for anyone receiving an email from Paul, they'd be none the wiser that his account had been compromised. And this is that trust element. Anyone receiving an email from Paul will trust that Paul is a legitimate sender. We know who he is. We can trust what he is sending us. And unfortunately, this is how then that attack continues to gain momentum, and then the attacker is able to enter and infiltrate other companies. This all happened, for those of you looking at the date, times, and stamps, that happened in August. In September, we then had another situation of another email being compromised. Completely separate story, different company, different part of the world. Eleonora takes to Twitter and says, hey, friends, colleagues, know that my email's been compromised. If you're receiving an invoice, it's not actually from me. Eleonora is somebody who is unknown to us, either at Darktrace or me personally, but unfortunately, this is a kind of Twitter public service announcement, if you will, that we're all too familiar with seeing. Or maybe sometimes a phone call, right? Hey, that email that you might have just received, don't click it. If my email was hacked, don't open it. And it's all well and good to try to get the word out there, but you're still only as fast and as effective as you're hoping that people see your warning before they actually click on the email. Over at SOCFIN UK, we were running a proof of value, which was already in active mode. So this was a little further down the line. Our friends at SOCFIN UK had already allowed the AI to take action on their behalf. And so what we're seeing on the right-hand side is Cash, who tweets back to Eleonora saying, you know what, Eleonora, you're actually doing this proof of value. The AI wasn't fooled. Even though there was existing correspondence between Eleonora and the people at SOCFIN UK, maybe Cash, maybe someone else, the AI was able to contextualize and understand that this wasn't normal for Eleonora. This wasn't the usual way in which she communicates. And so the email that the attacker sent out, because it wasn't a good impersonation of the way in which she communicates, the people she communicates with, it actually fired off all sorts of different warning signs, from solicitation, out of character tone, out of character attachment, all sorts of bizarre things that we might call gut instinct of, hey, something feels wrong. For the AI, this is a mathematical calculation based on the context of what it has understood to be the normal pattern of life for that specific company, or better, for that specific person. I think that these examples are helpful because they really show how an attack that starts from purchasing domains and sending out random emails can actually have very severe consequences, because it is also a trust attack to some degree. It is the type of attack that can have devastating consequences simply because it allows for a point of entry. In the first instance, where Paul Peterson's credentials had been used, I almost think, like, thank goodness that the attacker acted quickly after receiving that password, because, you know, we were there and we were seeing all of this. But for so many companies, there's such a huge time lapse between somebody gaining access and then using that access, that these low and slow attacks are actually very difficult for a human SOC team to be able to piece together. The AI actually is still able to piece these things together because it doesn't get tired. It doesn't forget about things that have happened in the past. So that's really how it's such a powerful tool. It's such a powerful thought process and methodology. And now is a perfect time for you to be introducing it within your companies, because it is a moment of great disruption. Our humans are tired. They are overworked and fatigued. So I would say that now is really the moment in which, in the same way that the attackers are innovating and they're moving their attack methodologies to target our workers, it's the perfect moment for us as defenders to be thinking, all right, now how do I shift my defense position as well? This might seem a little off topic. Darktrace is actually a sponsor of McLaren Racing Team. I saw today on social media the new car that they just released for the upcoming 2021 race season. But I think that there's something symbiotic, actually, of the collaboration between Darktrace and McLaren, not only because personally I'm a huge fan of the sport and of this team, but also because the analogy between, or not the analogy, sorry, but the thought around how a fraction of a second, a split-second decision can make the difference between winning and losing a race is very much the same mentality under which we need to be thinking, that a split-second decision is the difference between an attacker getting in and not. And that split-second decision, unfortunately, is often not one of the security team. It's of the worker. It's the worker's decision to trust the sender and open a link or open an attachment. And again, to go back to James's introduction, this isn't a failure of technology and of the the technologies that you've already invested in, but rather it's showing that the attackers continue to evolve their methodologies.
Good morning still, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We seem to have a cutout there of it. At this point, we can probably raise the curtain on that. That was a pre-recorded webinar from previously in the week, but the information is still incredibly pertinent. As you can see behind me, my library is currently being renovated, so you can see my collection of plants. So you can enjoy the bit of green. Mariana has also joined us today. Mariana, you're looking particularly lovely today. Thank you very much. And in as much as this was a recorded session, this part is absolutely live, and we're going to jump into a bit of the Q&A around this. And to me, this is a fascinating topic, looking at email security. I'm a huge fan of email. I am not a fan of a society that just gets rid of something because it became inconvenient, and even more so a society that wants to get rid of something because it does not want to deal with the hard issues. And for me in technology, email is the perfect representation of this problem. We have issues around email, and some people out there are convinced they can just wave a magic wand. We're going to need collaboration suites, whatever you want to call it, we'll get rid of email. It's not going to happen. Why? Because email is fantastic. I mean, it's great. It's accessible. It's an open protocol. You can run it through so many apps. And just when we thought email was getting a bit chunky, a bit slow, in came the web, in came these web services, Gmail, Office Online, all of those things. So email is wonderful, but how do we fix email? And that's today's topic. And Mariana, thank you for joining us. And maybe I should start you on that topic I've just raised. Some people say we should get rid of email. We should try all of these other new collaboration suites. Now, these suites are obviously great. They serve their purpose. But what's your view? Obviously, I believe you believe that we shouldn't get rid of email, but just make it stronger.
Thanks so much, James. And yes, this is live, although as you can see, it's the same background. So I'm in the same place. And yeah, I completely agree with you. We shouldn't get rid of it just because it's, you know, there are some inconveniences. But I think that if we do think about getting rid of email, then the alternative is, well, what are we moving to? And I find that this is one of the cases where the infrastructure itself isn't the problem. The attackers aren't using email to attack because it is technically an easier vehicle. It's because it is a vehicle to humans. And so no matter what alternative technology platform we go to, if it's just, you know, a live, always live on webinar, text messaging, some kind of instant messaging platform, the point remains that the communication that we have and the exchange that we have between humans, when funneled through a digital environment, presents challenges, from verifying who is actually sending, who is actually the person behind that keyboard or screen, to questions of, well, can I actually trust that individual, and how does that business of trust and that exchange, how is that conducted? And so I totally agree with you. The email itself, from a technology point of view, is one of the best things that we have, in the sense that it's collaborative, it is open. But by nature of that openness, it's also what gives the attackers an advantage in being able to use that infrastructure. So I think we need to get the best of both sides of that aspect, and allow us to continue working with that technology, because it is also the easiest for us as professionals, at least I think it is for me personally, rather than trying to fit the way that we work and communicate to serve technology. No, it's the other way around. Technology needs to serve us. We cannot become servants to the medium.
And I suppose there's also a point to be made about email being a known technology. We are at a stage where we're seeing a lot of upskilling and changes of how to do technology, and this is causing its own type of disruption. From the customers you work with, is there an appreciation that email has a sense of stability? It's a bit of a technology oasis within stacks, that at least we don't have to worry about that component as much as we need to worry about the rest of them.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I had never thought of it as a technology oasis, but I think you're onto something there. I might borrow that sentence. Yes, insofar that I think that every business, anyone that's hired into any kind of business in any industry and at any level, there is a reasonable expectation that just about everyone in the world knows how to email. So there is a minimum common denominator insofar that we are always looking for things where we can standardize across industries, across geographies, and email affords us that standardization, at least in terms of a common acceptance. I would be curious to hear if anyone disagrees with this, just as a provocation, but I would also think like, well, what else are we going to do? We're trying to do a connected world. We have very legitimate reasons why we need to have that connectivity and that minimum standard. But having said that, James, if an oasis is a place of safety, is also that safety that then gives us that false sense of security. And that, I think, is where the point of the attackers, 94% of all cybersecurity attacks are originating in the inbox. Why? Again, it's not, I don't think that that is necessarily a technological problem. I think that at the heart of it, it is the humans being tricked by having received something that they then should not have actioned. And that's a complicated question, because just even in the way that I phrased it is they received something they should not have actioned. And even in our language, we tend to default to this sort of binary way of thinking. This is good, this is bad. I can or I cannot do this. When we know that the reality of the decision-making process is much more complex. So for us to get intuition around a yes-no answer, there's so much that goes into it. And that is very, very difficult to then translate that into a cybersecurity policy or into a cybersecurity strategy. That's why AI is powerful, because it will mimic that intuition that we have rather than trying to build it with a set of binary rules. And I think that that is, whatever it is we're talking about, if it's email, if it's chat, we need to be moving away from thinking of how do we address the security challenge with a yes-no, but how do we get that intuition back into the operations.
Thank you. And let's quickly look at the audience. We've got a question there. Just a reminder to anybody listening, everybody listening in, you can post your questions in the chat section and I will pose them to Mariana. Angus Smith asked a question that's more comparing you to your competitors. He is asking about Mimecast, but I'm going to paraphrase and asking if you had to compare Darktrace in terms of the effectiveness versus other similar products in the market, perhaps measured through a Magic Quadrants, and where does Darktrace fit into the market compared to everyone else?
So we have an interesting situation now with things like Magic Quadrants or analyst tables, because Darktrace has always existed a bit of a sphere of its own, and no analyst has ever created a category just for us. So there's some challenges there. But what I would say is that secure email gateway providers, such as the one that was mentioned, but also any secure email gateway provider, tends to look at email flows en masse. And they do a very similar job also, as are now natively available in Microsoft Office 365 and Defender. In the vast majority of your email vendor, right? If it's Microsoft, if it's Google, whoever it is that you're using for your email infrastructure, they are now offering some level of security built into the expectation. So I think that we have also moved away from that idea of just putting on more and more layers that do the same thing, but rather we need to be thinking of those complementary approaches. So gateway providers, as well as those email providers, generally look en masse to say, do I see evidence of this attack across many of my customers, across a wide range of infrastructures, across a wide range of contacts? And what they are in a very good position to do is to identify that attack or to identify that threat vector, and then very quickly stop that thing from happening again. And that's really powerful, especially when you're operating at a large scale, as is the email world. But what it fails to do, it fails to understand those subtle nuances between businesses or the individuals. So that, I think, is where the AI can play a very important part in learning those subtleties, in learning those environments that are unique to you and unique also to the different teams within your business, and therefore understand when something is unusual for that context. So I would say, James, that balance between, yes, it's important to have a big picture understanding, what's happening across the entire world. But to a certain point, what we care about is our colleagues, right? We don't want our business to be falling for impersonation or be used, the identity of our CEO be used to then influence the activities maybe of newer, more junior personnel. So they are very different in that approach. Having said that, yes, we are also able to stop the attacks en masse, but Darktrace, our AI learns in the individual. And while we do have 7-8 years of advantage of learning and applying those learnings, we come at it from a very different starting point.
Thank you. I just want to tell our audience, if you go over to the Office tab, you can see the offer from darktrace.com, the 30 days proof of value. You can put it to the test and see if it works for you. And I'm pretty sure it would. At the very least, you need something to protect your email. And to that point, Mariana, I'm going to share you a bit of what happened to me recently, and I would be interested to see how technology would respond to this. I received a phishing email a couple of days ago from my bank, and for once, a phishing email actually looking for my bank, not a bank I don't belong to. It looked completely legit. It was a policy renewal. I decided, let me go have a look at it later. Later, I go and I'm like, okay, I want to see about my policy, and I look at when I go to attachment, I see it's a zip file, and banks don't send zip files. And then I look a bit closer to the email itself, and then it says we would like to update your details, etc., etc. Those are two very common ways that they try and catch us out in these things. A nicely built email, the domain is spoofed, everything is fine there. But if it wasn't for the fact that there was a zip attachment, if it was a PDF, I might have even clicked on it. Are these the kind of basic steps, best practice steps that an AI would then interpret and do on its own, kind of this logical thinking of connecting those dots and saying, A and B don't quite add up here, even though it is very subtle?
Yes, I think that's a very good summary of it. And but you have gone ahead a step forward and said already to me that it was unusual to receive a zip file because it was from a bank, and they don't tend to do that. How do you know that? You know this because you have learned it through the power of observation. Nobody has ever, I don't think, all of our audience now knows that that particular bank doesn't send zip files, but I would say that it is not a rule that banks nowhere in the world ever send zip files. But you've learned that from the observation that you have made based on those legitimate exchanges that you have with your bank. That is exactly how the AI also learns, is based on that contextual learning. And that means, and I'm guessing here, James, that if you'd have dug into the sending address and you'd have gone into the headers and you would have looked for more of the technical specifications of what domain, where was the ISP, where in the world was the IP from, we would have found other bits of evidence. And those, again, would have been at odds with that historic pattern or that historic context of how the legitimate bank actually communicates with you. So I'm guessing that this wasn't actually sent from your bank, but rather a very good impersonation, a very good graphics department that will have mimicked the layout and the logo. But imagine if it had been an insider at the bank that was actually sending you a correspondence from the bank, and it was a rogue trader. How would you protect against that? And those are the smaller, even more subtle indicators that fortunately wasn't the case. But what we see is the AI really catching on. And we have a blog actually where a drinks manufacturer, what happened was that one of their suppliers, the supplier was compromised. And so it was the infrastructure of their supplier that was sending phishing emails. But the AI was able to tell, all right, even though this is a legitimate sender, even though we already know that they are valid, in air quotes here for those of you not seeing the screen, it was able to determine, okay, well, these are emails that are appearing to be unusual. And then when the suppliers figured out that they were being used as an attack vector and they stopped it, then they sent out an email saying, okay, we're back to normal. And the AI was also able to accompany that and understand, right, now this is different again. So that is that intuition, that power of the personalization and of the customization of the self-learning AI that, as you said, I would encourage everyone to try it. You will see firsthand in your own environments what is getting through those existing security measures that you already have. And don't panic. We can do something about it, right?
Can you maybe, it's great that you can customize the AI and really build it to your environment, but I assume there are some best practice out of the box things that these things should be capable of. Obviously, there's a question to ask what Darktrace's software can do, but let's take it from a best practice point of view. If somebody were to expect this kind of solution to deliver protection for them, what should they ask for out of the box, in your view?
The first thing that I would say is that it has to work in the real world out of the box, and it has to work quickly. So I would say that any vendor, and this is not just email security, I'm saying this in general, with any AI, test that it works in the real world, because it's all well and good seeing it in a demo or in a lab, but you need to have it work in the real world. The second expectation is that you need to understand what has happened. It is also very frustrating to have a black box AI that you don't understand the decision-making process. So you need to have that understanding, which brings me to the third thing, which is visibility. This is your environment and it is your business. So you need to understand it, and for you to understand it, you need to be able to see it and get to the minutia that you want. So also look for a vendor, and of course we do all three things, but I would say challenge your vendors or your technology providers to make sure that it is making sense to you and that you are understanding everything that you need to understand. And I would say, James, that having that granular understanding, I'm big on data and big on raw data, and every company will be different. So the use cases to what somebody needs to report on or what matters to someone will be different. So if you have that granular understanding, if you have access to that data, you can then build the use cases that make sense for you. And you have to have that flexibility. So I would say understanding, visibility, and it needs to work in the real world.
And that is very true. We often see these technologies look very well in the lab, and then when you actually put them in the right situation, you have a problem. Let's touch in a little bit then on the actual training, almost the automation of this AI. Nobody wants to. The problem with security is you don't want something that's going to take a lot of your time. There are other things to focus on. So in terms of deploying, training, watching this AI to make sure it's learning the right things, what would your customers do, and what do you guys as Darktrace bring into that equation as well?
So the proof of value is essentially our learning period. And what will happen is you set up a journaling rule. So assuming in the cloud infrastructure, right? Well, so the way that we do it, we set up a journaling rule, copy of the emails are sent to our AI for analysis. This is a dedicated and custom space in the cloud for every instance. So there's no cross-contamination of data. And the AI will learn that flow of all of the emails, inbound, outbound, so that it has an understanding and it starts evolving that sense of, okay, well, what is this business about? Because it will not have had any training or any exposure to anything ahead of that. We ask for a minimum of 7 days to learn. The reason for that is because on the weekend, suddenly there's no email flow and the AI has no idea what has happened to all the humans. So we need to teach the AI that we haven't all died. We just took the weekend. So 7 days, 10 really if we want to be super cautious and really strong. But by day 7, we are already seeing some results. And what the AI will do is very quickly start doing all the analysis and all the fancy math to figure out, okay, well, these are these peer groups, and out of that peer group, I have this anomaly, or these are the kind of things that I expect. During the 30-day period, the first week is used for the learning. The next 3 weeks are used for us showing you, this is what the AI has identified. This is how it's found these things. This is what it would have done. And so part of that journey is also seeing how the AI would respond and building your trust in the AI to then allow it to take those responses for its own, on its own and in real time. And that's a really, I love working with customers and prospects through this journey because it is such a relief when you can see it and you agree with it. And when you don't agree with it, it's very easy to then say, all right, well, the reason why you don't agree with it is because, and you explain it. So we're working in parallel. These are 3 weeks in which the humans and the AI are working with each other, learning from each other. And by the end of that process, you have a fully trained AI that is bespoke to your environment.
Does that feed into reporting capabilities as well? You did touch on this, but I'm very curious in that I can see several potential benefits other than it just doing protection. Firstly, the AI would be able to tell you in fairly quick time what kind of targeting you might be facing. Maybe you notice there's somebody being very ambitious and trying to get at you in a certain period. The other one is I can imagine good training tips for reinforcing personnel to understand what's happening as well. Could you expand a bit on how we can, or how company can leverage the AI and its discovery to further reinforce security culture in the organization?
Certainly, and that's such a great application of it, because as you said, the loud stuff, the mass stuff, I always think that's easy, right? It's like big spikes, it's not sophisticated, it's very easy to address. It's the smaller, more subtle attacks that you need to be, and that I'm sure everyone also is more concerned about. So we have automatic reports generated by the AI. These are written in a pretty standard, first there's some statistics that you can look at in terms of what and how the attack profile has changed against your organization. But the other side of it is also thinking, all right, well, what's going out? And am I happy with the policies and the education that I have provided to my users about how to best also send email? So one of those situations which has happened, I was working with one of our customers, was that they said, oh, I had no idea that these users were sending very important documents via email. And this particular customer had spent an enormous amount of effort setting up a collaboration cloud space, but the users, back to that sort of like a common denominator, everyone is accustomed to email. And so what had happened was, in a completely benign situation of insider threat, the C-level executive sending these projection documents with some very, very important fiscal projections to their personal device so that they could be working with them, as well as also collaborating with some other users. And those files were now transiting onto non-secure, non-approved ways. So James, back to that sort of visibility of understanding exactly what's happening. Just understanding that has happened means that we now know who we need to be working with to say, right, there's an education piece, which is, this is very important because it represents a risk. And it's not about just shutting things down or blocking people. It's about identifying those users that represent the risk and teaching them a better and safer way to work in this digital ecosystem. The other thing with reporting that I think is interesting is that, especially with something like AI and with this AI, is that over the course of time, because it just stops everything from coming through, we forget that we're being attacked. The reports help remind us that we need to stay vigilant. And it's not that we stopped getting spam or phishing emails because the attackers have stopped. No, it's because we've invested in really powerful technologies that have identified those emails and allow the business to function as normal. So the reports also help validate that, to say, right, well, what could have happened? And we see that, in the summary of, this is what was stopped, this is why it was stopped, and so on.
And I think that is an incredibly valid point. It's the big problem with security. You don't realize you need it until you didn't have it and you needed it. And I think as security professionals often have a hard time motivating what they're doing and that there are actual results. Because the problem with security is, if there are no results, that's the result you want. Another question from the audience. First one relates to what you said earlier, but does the standard AI instance of Darktrace, is installed at each customer base, and then they start training it from there, and that teaches them the normal behavior for that? And then a follow-up question is also, Darktrace AI, do you guys maintain a global database that is constantly being updated with blacklisted domains, addresses, IPs, and such elements?
No, so yes to the first question, no to the second. Every installation, every customer deployment, every proof of value that we do, the AI is new. It's like a newborn baby. It has no preconception of your environment, so it needs to learn from scratch. And in terms of database of blacklist, no, that's not the industry and it's not the methodology that we have and that we maintain. What we do is, however, we are able to integrate with threat intelligence providers, and there are some instances where it might make sense to do a check with one of these providers, and there are sometimes some protocols that we use even in those verification moments, like secondary or tertiary checks that we might run. But that's the difference between not needing to rely on the blacklists versus using them because, well, they're there, we might as well use them. But if a security vendor is dependent on identifying the blacklist or the sender, then you'll always be reactive. You will stop the second attack from happening. You will stop the third and fourth and every subsequent one, but you don't stop the first. With Darktrace, what the AI does is, because it doesn't need the blacklist, it doesn't need to know that something is bad. It understands the context and it understands, oh, this doesn't sound, back to James, your example with the bank, something was off, right? And you then explained, okay, this is what was off. The AI does that in much faster than we can do it. And so it's that same intuition to say, yes, oh, by the way, it has also appeared on a blacklist, but the reason why it created that alert, it created that trigger, was because there was something that it didn't belong.
And from my point of view, just anecdotally, I'm not a fan of blacklists. I don't know if a lot of companies know this, but if you're not hosting if you're hosting email of a smaller ISP, and that same ISP is also providing services, for example, people sending out email marketing, blacklists ban a range of IPs. So you just suddenly find out, no wonder your emails are simply not arriving at all, and nothing will notify you of this. I personally went through this situation. I've met many companies that ran into this situation, and I take to the point that it is reactive. It's a good backup, I suppose, but I like this approach of Darktrace where we're trying to be real-time and intelligent and responsive to the environment. And for that, let me bring in my last question to you, Mariana. A big problem today with remote working is that the ability to compromise somebody is now on a device that is quite far removed, and you may have some technologies give you a little point of presence locally to drop down in latency. But the real problem that's happening is what you mentioned earlier. People copy stuff to their personal email addresses or to their personal devices to get around policies and stuff, because these things are inhibiting the flow and speed of work. How does an AI solution like this interact with the working remote situation and kind of these compounding problems where users are not willing to play ball because of the inconvenience being created by modern security?
Yeah, and it happens all the time. And it's singularly one of the biggest frustrations that I know a lot of CISOs have, right? Which is like, why don't they just play ball? So I think it speaks to the richness of the digital environment. So historically, we think of all of the different environments that we might be playing with, all of those different applications, those vendors, and that data that transits. And the old way of doing security would be, let's get all of those logs together and let's start to look for those correlations and build policies, build rules. And of course, we know that it doesn't work and it doesn't scale. If we think about how instead to flip that around and we say, right, well, what does AI eat for breakfast? Data. And the more data we allow the AI to consume, the better it becomes. So if we think about email, email is already a great example because it is both the communication and the application, but it's also in the cloud. So it is already a cloud environment that sort of overlaps that question of, well, then is this email security or is it cloud security or is it corporate security? But it goes to my client device. So this is device security. If we try to box everything into checkboxes and policies, that's how attackers are getting around it. That is not how humans work. We want to get the job done. We will use whatever tool, whatever communication channel, and we want to encourage that. So what I would say is, let's flip the flow. Figure out where your data is transiting through and allow the AI to have an understanding of that. So traffic mirroring, connectors, sensors, whatever it is, the technology is here to serve the needs of the humans. So if the humans are wanting to use an application, great, let's understand that. So I think, I'm not sure, James, if I fully answered it, but I'm conscious of the fact that I'm rambling here and we have to stop. But yes, it is about, we have the data. We've already lived through the era of big data. And now it's the era and it's the time for the AI to do something with big data, because humans just, we are limited in the capability of what we can do.
And I think that last point of view concludes it beautifully. It's time for the AI to get involved here. I remember a few years ago interviewing people about AI in security, and both on the protection and on the criminal side, it was still a hazy topic. A lot of people said the expertise wasn't out there, etc. But I think generally we were still skeptical about relying on this kind of technology. But we are certainly seeing that AI is becoming much more prominent, and what you guys are doing at Darktrace is definitely trailblazing into that era. I can personally say my experience of security is we can only do so much with basic protocol, basic policy, and even user education. We should not underestimate how the guys out there are motivated, driven, and becoming very sophisticated in how they do things. Behavior security is where things need to happen. Just to take a recent example, I believe SolarWinds. If you look at that attack, that compromised the company at such a fundamental level, I would question if any policy or any level of reporting would have spotted that. But if you had an AI that said, hang on, this behavior is not adding up, that's quite different. And maybe that's what we need to look at for these incredibly sophisticated attacks, but also just the simple ones, and cut down on human error. But to that point, thank you very much for joining us today. This was a great introduction to Darktrace, to using AI to reinforce your email security. And I do expect we will see this kind of methodology start growing into other areas of security as well. And eventually, your security will come from your AI. I would like to thank our guest today, Mariana Pereira. She is the Director of Email Security Products at Darktrace. Unfortunately, she had to jump out, I believe, for another meeting. Everything is on top of each other these days. Please go to the offers section to look at the 30-day proof of value from Darktrace. Mariana's back with us.
Sorry, James. Somehow I got kicked off the room, but I just want to say an actual goodbye. But yes, thank you for having me today.
Thank you for presenting today, for answering our questions. We definitely hope to see you again soon. My name is James Francis. This was a webinar from ITWeb and Darktrace. Final mention, go to the Office tab, try out the 30-day proof of value, start seeing what artificial intelligence can do for security. This might just be the first stepping stone in eventually liberating ourselves from this big scourge sitting at the moment. But without further ado, please enjoy your afternoon. We'll see you at the next one, and goodbye from us. Bye-bye.